We've gone live, and we're just going to sort of hold for a few moments as we let a few more people join the call, Scott, and then we'll just say give it a few minutes, and get a few more people online as they're joining as we speak. And I'll say now to anyone who's already online that feel free to fire over questions as we talk. The questions go into the Q&A area, and we will try and respond to them as and when they come up, just to keep it a little bit lively. And there's a few more people joining, Scott, which is great. And so we'll kick off in a couple of moments. And for anyone who's online and doesn't know, Scott's in New Jersey, and it's been snowing. It would seem. Whereas
It's a
whereas we
beautiful snow.
Yeah, we've got grey, rainy, drizzly. Actually, yeah. Talking of snow, Scott, and this is completely beside the point. Just whilst we're waiting for people to join. I saw not that long ago somebody had spectrometered the reflection in snow, and it's fascinating how complete the spectrum seems to be in the reflection of snow. And it's quite obvious, but maybe, but just fascinating.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most interesting things about it is that you'd think a lot of this stuff we'd already know, but there's so many things that we didn't really look at closely. I mean, we take a picture of the sun, point a spectrometer at it, and say that's good, and that's really represents only a small portion of what we actually get into the body. So.
Yeah. So we're 2 minutes past. We've got a few more people in, so maybe we'll make a start, Scott. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for the fourth in the Meaning of Light series of talks. And of course, a huge welcome to Scott, who is joining us from New Jersey today. Just a little bit about the series. The Meaning of Light series is a series of talks exploring the topic of light and our connection to it. We started the series in September with Anna Levin, author of Incandescent. We then had Professor Russell Foster talking about circadian and biological rhythms in October. And last month we were joined by Professors Glenn Jeffrey and Bob Fosbury, where we were exploring the topic of the infrared revolution. So today we have the pleasure to have Scott with us, and we'll be diving into the world. Well, let's say we'll start by diving into the world of melatonin and the optics of the human body. But before we jump in, I'd like to say that I first became aware of Scott through his paper, Melatonin, the Optics of the Human Body, about 4 years ago. And it really inspired me to learn more about light as opposed to lighting. We've known about things like photosynthesis for about 250 years, and it seems that we're only now really contemplating how light influences our physiology. And maybe with the advent of electricity and artificial lighting, we've lost our connection to something which is fundamentally important for all life on Earth. I'll just mention here that if anybody at any stage has a question and wants to fire a question to Scott, please do so in the Q&A. And before we really kick things off, I want to use a couple of Scott's quotes, which are, I think really quite impactful, and I'm sure we're going to touch upon them as we go through the talk. Sunlight used to represent the largest energy input into the body. That's quote number one. Quote number two is that the other thing that I think people need to understand is that right now what we're going through is really the largest reduction in solar exposure in human history. And maybe that sort of sets the tone for the talk. So Scott, maybe if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what led you to putting together the research paper back in 2019. And then I'm sure we're going to start talking about where we are today and how we've progressed and what we're finding out. So Scott, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm an optical engineer, started out as a mechanical engineer, spent a lot of time on displays and lighting over 40 years, and I've got 86 issued patents in the area. I got started looking at this. I had been working in lighting for a while, and I was looking for a new type of light source. It was okay. And I saw all this stuff going on with red light therapy, and I went and I actually interviewed Hamlin. And I walked away from it thinking to myself, all the levels that he's talking about are easily generated in by incandescent lighting, a well-lit incandescent room, and also its orders of magnitude are significantly lower than what we get outdoors. And so I thought, well, I'll just go look up what the looked at the optics of the body, and I thought, this would be something that everybody had looked at, and we had a clear understanding about how sunlight interfaces with the body. And in reality, I found that that was not the case. We knew very little, and very little work had gone on trying to understand how sunlight penetrates the body, where it goes, what the body is doing with it. And the deeper and deeper I dug, I kept on finding all these optical elements, I'd call them, or mechanisms that the body had evolved to do that localized, especially the near infrared, in some of our most important tissues. In particular, the brain, the fetus, the eye, the retina, the skin. All these things are some really amazing optical process or mechanisms, and they, as I say, they localize and increase the amount of near infrared to visible ratio on some of our most sensitive tissues. And it was really hard to begin with, because if you look at most of the literature, they incorrectly assign a penetration depth of near infrared to millimeter or something like that. Yeah, you can literally go in, put your thumb over your cell phone, walk into a dark room, and you'll see that the entire thumb glows. And Bob Fosbury's classic picture of a hand under 830 nanometer illumination shows that the sunlight in those particular wavelengths are going deep into the body, inches into the body, and localizing in things like blood and other places. And you're just asking, why is it going to all that trouble? What's the big extent? And I ran across a paper. I was looking at some of Wunsch's work, and he had a figure in there from Zostro, where he was using electron spin resonance to determine the reactive oxygen species generation in skin samples. And I looked at it and I said, hey, I can load that in with my optical models. And what you immediately start to see, you don't have to make something fancy. You can see that there's tons of reactive oxygen species being generated in the body at different depths, at different locations, by sunlight. And is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Well, what it was clear is that the reactive oxygen species levels are high enough that there had to be an antioxidant response. And so I started looking around and ran into Russ, and Russ is an amazing guy. For 40 years, he's been trying to get the science community to accept that melatonin is being produced everywhere in your mitochondria. And he has all these things he's gone through and tried to do in the show. And I walked in, or I called him up and talking to him, and he said, Scott, nobody's looking at this effect of sunlight on biology and what effect it's having. And so he said, we need to put a paper together. Well, Russ has got about 100,000 citations to his name. And I thought, well, this would be a great thing to put up for the IES. And so I went and I said, hey, I'll write a paper. Unfortunately, when I wrote the paper, they immediately decided it was not something that they wanted to publish because it basically was saying is that what we're doing now is creating a toxic light source because it's removing an important component from sunlight, which is used to stimulate the formation of antioxidants in response to reactive oxygen species. And this was a hypothesis, and I put the paper together, and it was actually a blessing that IES decided not to publish it, but because it actually forced us to put it into a medical journal, and and take a little bit more, I guess, be peer reviewed and a few other things. And then that's of course been followed up with a couple of papers where we were able to show that, lo and behold, in the case of transient events where you have a stressor like you're doing exercise, you're going outside, all of a sudden melatonin levels are skyrocketing. Bear in mind that most of the circadian lore is built around the concept that melatonin is high at night, cortisol is low, is high during the day, or at least in the morning. And that's done or measured under very controlled conditions where you're not doing anything. Because the reality is the minute you do something, melatonin and cortisol ramp up rapidly together. And there was a paper done by Theron where he took people and put them on stair steppers for 4 hours and continuously monitored their melatonin levels in their blood as they were going through the exercise. And there's only about 4 papers that actually do this during exercise, during a stressor. And lo and behold, what you saw at 9 o'clock in the morning is melatonin spiked up to 200 picograms per milliliter, and then kind of plateaued and then fell back down after you stopped doing the exercise. So in some ways, I would argue that a lot of the circadian stuff is only under controlled conditions, and it's not quite as important as people give it credit for, because there's so many other things going on. And somebody explained to me how you can 9 o'clock in the morning you can get a spike in melatonin simply by doing something. And what it appears, based on the data, is that when your muscles are starting to generate extreme amounts of reactive oxygen species, they respond by generating the appropriate amount of melatonin. If the exercise continues, eventually some of that excess melatonin overflows into the plasma of the blood, and therefore you get a pretty good indication that Russ is right. The mitochondria is locally generating antioxidants in the form of melatonin, stimulating glutathione. All these things are going on, and that's how we basically deal with stressors. And so, we wrote the paper, published that, and it has had in my opinion, it is a definitive statement that like I say, Russ is right, that the melatonin is being generated in the mitochondria. So I was doing all this work, and we published the data, and I then along came COVID, and I was really interested in trying to see whether or not the things we were learning about sunlight had a big impact on transmission for COVID, during the pandemic. And using some of the techniques we talked about, I basically was trying to talk to Fauci's group at the NIAID and the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, on actually trying to understand how the environment was protecting some, provide protection. Because bear in mind, during the pandemic, we saw that up to 99.9% of all disease transmissions occurred indoors. Very few occurred outdoors. And so what I started looking at is trying to understand how the body was using the outdoors, how the environmental factors of being outdoors essentially prevented this. And there was at the Gates Foundation, there was a gentleman, Dr. Dowell, and he made a statement that, let's just get it right so I don't mistake it. But if we knew what suppressed the influenza in summertime, it would be a lot more effective than any flu vaccine we have. And I think that is a very important statement. And so I tried to get them to introduce various parts of our natural environment into some of their tests. And unfortunately, they refused, saying that they were too busy to work on vaccines. But we went ahead and we started doing some models about how the sunlight was impacting, disease transmission during the pandemic, and did some really great computational fluid dynamics studies that showed that sunlight was does directly impact large droplets. But what most people aren't aware of is that within sunlight also creates on a circadian cycle high levels are germicidal levels of hydrogen peroxide and ozone on the surface of the earth every day. And that at night, the sunlight is impacting our causes the microbes to release, once they've absorbed energy from the sunlight for the microbes, they then release nitric oxide at night. So what you have in nature, and the reason that we're seeing uh, so much problem with indoor spaces and disease transmission is we're essentially removing nature's Lysol can from our environment, indoor environment, and it's a real concern of me with all the work going on IAQ, because that strips out most of the beneficial parts of sunlight. And the unique thing is that sunlight is doing two things, both direct and indirect. But then there's a third element, and that's where I really got started getting excited is that, you know, when we are outdoors, our immune system is at a higher level than when we are indoors because sunlight tends to stimulate the enhanced immune response. This, you can look at multiple papers out there where they're showing that the innate immune response levels increase, the T cell velocities increase. There's all kinds of stuff going on. So, you know, I'm if anybody has a good connection with RFK Jr., let me know. I think that with processed sunlight is more important than processed food, in my opinion. And you know, that's where, you know, when you start realizing what the body is doing and how sunlight is affecting it, you have to then start looking at and saying, hey, we just threw away 90% of the spectrum, and are the things we're having to do now, like blue blockers and red light therapy, they're almost like trying to get back to natural sunlight. And you know, as I told you, I'm a blue advocate. You know, as far as trying to say that blue light shouldn't get the bum rap it gets, because if there was enough red there, it would be great. You know, we walk
And
around in a blue sky forever. You know.
and it's about balance, right? It's about creating that balance. You know, we've evolved under a sort of balanced system, and we're sort of moving away from that balance. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things really that you mentioned, which you know, as a, let's say, a lighting person, having worked in the industry for quite some time, you know, your paper really opened my eyes because of the fact that, you know, I think I was maybe a little bit brainwashed around the fact that, you know, melatonin was entirely coming from the pineal gland, you know, we sort of, let's say, yeah, that's the sort of the information that we had to hand, and clearly that seems to be very, very different to what your findings were in terms of, you know, the response to exercise and so on and so forth. So then, you know, melatonin, as I understand it, is probably the strongest antioxidant that we have in the system. And then I want to touch on the point that you brought about with regards to, you know, the period through COVID and the pandemic. And if I'm not wrong, there's quite a lot of whether it was studies or whether it was assumptions that, you know, people with a high vitamin D level were less susceptible to COVID. If I'm not wrong, what was then actually found was that the vitamin D was just a sort of a proxy for the amount of time we spent out in, you know, in sunlight. And actually maybe there are other mechanisms, and maybe there were other mechanisms, and maybe the mechanism that you're talking about today, which is, you know, our exposure to long wavelengths of light stimulating the mitochondria to sort of produce the melatonin, maybe that is more likely to have been the actual yeah, the reality. I don't know. Yeah, maybe you've got some information on that I don't have. Maybe it wasn't the vitamin D levels. Maybe, as I say, it was just the amount of sunlight we were exposed to that was then stimulating our mitochondrial melatonin?
Yeah, well, part of the problem is there's so many processes, different processes. Like, Glenn said, just sent you an email about some of his work, and he said I could go ahead and say talk about it a little bit. But what he did is he basically took some incandescent lights, put them in an area, and then he's the world's expert on measuring eye response. And he was in a matter of 2 weeks, he was able to show that, there was a significant gain in your ability to differentiate colors just by having the incandescent in the room. And, and so I think that, you can look at that two different ways. It's either, on that particular biomarker, it's either that it's benefiting, or you can say that the LEDs that were in the room were causing harm. And based on all the different things that we're seeing now, I've come to the conclusion that what we actually have created is a toxic environment in our lighting because we threw away 90% of the spectrum. And therefore, the industry needs to figure out how to put it back. And if they don't, I think they'll have some severe negative consequences because I like to liken this to almost like a second renaissance. I mean, Roger Seaholt's got some great videos out on his MedCram, and he's showing that, 100 years ago, this was the norm. Patients would be rolled out into the sunlight because they showed that, you know, that had a positive impact on their outcome. Now we have, and then what happened is that the big pharma came along. It wasn't big at that point, but they basically ran a lot of those people out of business. And we've now got our sickest people sitting in rooms that allow no near infrared, virtually no sunlight to come in. They're exposed to artificial lighting that, in my opinion, drops the immune response. Especially, I keep on saying that if you look at it just from a purely, there was some great work by Gao on cortisol, and cortisol is very important. It's essentially the yin and yang to melatonin. But what it shows is that, during exercise you get exactly the same response. You get this cortisol going up exactly in concert with melatonin. So it's really, and then there was this really interesting study where they looked at people who had schizophrenia and clinical depression, and they measured their melatonin to cortisol ratios at midnight when melatonin should be high. It was 5 times lower than the control of healthy people. And so I think that, while I started out on melatonin, I'm now pretty well moving towards cortisol. And I think one of the most exciting things is that this is actually I just got a biosensor. And it's a biosensor, you did your thing with your to
Yep.
measure light exposure. Well, this is a biosensor that is capable of measuring every 3 minutes the melatonin, cortisol, IL-6, and TNF alpha characteristics of your sweat. And so, I just got them. We're going to start doing some experiments. The gentleman, Saramram at Cordy, is just bringing them out. They're still on a experimental stage. But I'm really hopeful that what's going to happen is as we go forward, all these biosensors, people are used to glucose meters, they're used to, their watches, to now have the ability to actually see in real time, like I say, at a high sampling frequency, what's going on, I think is an exciting part of what's going on, and why I think that we're literally coming into a second renaissance for sunlight, because now people are starting to appreciate it. They're starting to ask questions that we didn't ask before. And, I think it's really important because, I mean, what we're seeing over and over again are all these different negative effects, whether it be, generational drops in testosterone, whether it be the, certain populations being more susceptible, low in vitamin D, and you start looking at all these different things and the astronauts having mitochondrial damage after being up in the space station for 6 months. I mean, if Musk wants to go to Mars, I think that's great, but right now he's not going to have anybody alive by the time they get there, based on what they're exposing the astronauts to. And, there's just so many of these little things that are starting to tick and click and paste are pieces of the puzzle that I think that people need to start taking a real hard look at whether or not what we've created is an artificial environment that is really negative, and needs to, if you're in a deep enough hole, it doesn't really matter what you do while you're in the hole. You're not getting out. We keep on digging it deeper and deeper. And, so many ways I feel like the need for blue blockers, or the effect of red light therapy is really just a cry out for us to get back to real sunlight exposure, because the wavelengths, why do you need a blue blocker? You need a blue blocker because the blue that you're looking at has nothing to do with the blue on your sky, for the sky. The blue in the sky is almost entirely near infrared, and it is, it's not like I say, you'll look at a sunset, it's got red and orange, but if you look behind you, it's all blue and violet, you know. So I'm not sure how circadian quite works in that particular effect. I believe that circadian is driven by dimming range. And I think that's one of the things that the industry really needs to. We gave up a lot of, not only did we give up spectrum, near infrared content when we shipped from LED to LEDs, we also gave up dimming range. You're talking about 1,000,000 to 1 dimming range in daytime versus nighttime. You know, if you get it dark enough, I don't care what the spectrum of the light is, it's irrelevant. It's just that to me is where we're kind of missing it right now. And that is why I'm so excited about the biosensors, because now you can actually be measuring things in real time during stressors rather than measuring it under artificial conditions, like they do for so much of the circadian stuff. Not knocking circadian, it definitely does something. Just saying that there's a lot of other things that just as important or more important. Because when you think about it from a standpoint of if the mitochondria are truly generating melatonin, there are trillions of mitochondria in the body. Pineal gland melatonin was selected by the pineal gland because it is the most effective antioxidant. It is not there to basically put you to sleep. It is basically there because the brain is still operating at 80% of its capacity, generating tons of reactive oxygen species. So the pineal gland dumps it off, and it dumps a bunch of stuff in there to kind of deal with it. And some of it overflows into the blood, and cells that have a low deficiency in melatonin can maybe suck it up. It's just a very efficient way of distributing a little extra antioxidant, in my opinion. But, I'm sure other people would disagree. But
I mean, you sort of referenced a little bit earlier the sort of comparison between light and food, sort of considering light as nutrition, and certainly when you I'm just going to read back your statement. Sunlight used to represent the largest energy input into the body. And it made me think, that there was, Morgan Spurlock, who sadly, passed, made the film Supersize Me. And, for what was it, a month, anytime, you could only eat fast food. And for a month, anytime that he was asked to supersize, he had to supersize. And, within a very short space of time, his physiology started to change. You know, are we seeing something similar in your mind as a result of us being, uh, you know, having this strong lack of solar exposure?
I think exactly true. And in fact, I'd say it's worth. I mean, we get up to 30 megajoules per day, if we're in direct sunlight, run around buck naked. If you look at calories, you're looking at about 8 to 10 megajoules type thing from food. But I think what's most important is that when you start looking at how light is absolutely is distributed in the body, especially in the skin, you get some very strong, unique effects that are associated with the longer wavelengths, which people tend to poo-poo as not being important, actually is the location of the highest concentration of photons in the body, because the water in our outer part, that's why if you take some photography in the mid-infrared, shortwave infrared, and running from anywhere from about 1500 out to 3000, we all have black skin because water absorption, and we have white hair. Because there's such a strong absorption of water in that particular point. Your shirt would look white because it's not, if it's dry, but you are essentially absorbing have the highest absorptivity and absorption going on in that wavelength range. Well, there's a professors there shown that, taking water and exposing it to high levels and other of light in those longer wavelengths, or incandescent in particular, generates hydrogen peroxide. Why in the heck do you want hydrogen peroxide on the outside of your skin? I would argue that it ends up being a protective layer for for all the pathogens coming in, but more importantly, it in the other end of the spectrum, in the UV, where we're trying to generate vitamin D, it's very different. Melanin tends to absorb the highest. Now, it's really hard to photo bleach melanin. That's its purpose. But add a little hydrogen peroxide to it and photochemically, and it bleaches like a gangbusters. And there was work by Yakimov who showed that true enough, the melatonin or the melanin levels were bleached in the outer part of the skin, and that therefore it would increase. I mean, based on some of the stuff I found, you're looking at a 5x or so increase in the probability of absorbing UVB and breaking down 7-DHC hydrocholesterol that we use to generate all the different steroids, not just vitamin D. And there's plenty of literature out there that shows that the skin is capable of generating all those hormones without sending it back to the glands. So I think that underestimating what the body is doing in sunlight to protect itself and its ability to protect itself is a big mistake. And, unfortunately, what we did is we took away the main components that the body was using, and, which then created problems. And then, when you start doing, the nice thing about physics and optics is that you can drop the politics. I mean, I did a paper with Professor John Louis, and he's been trying to get the Black community to understand, the importance of their getting sunlight and getting vitamin D into their regimen, especially when they've been displaced to higher latitudes where the body is not actually evolutionarily optimized for. And so I think that on top of all this, you get to layer the effect that, are we causing anxiety in children? Because if you look at it optically, children are much more susceptible to these changes than adults are because they're physically smaller. So if I have a fixed penetration characteristic, more of the child's cells are impacted than adults. So, I mean, it's just kind of like a cascade of things that you're working on a puzzle, you get that one piece in and you start seeing all these other things. Now, I could be totally delusional, but the point is that there's a lot of pieces that are starting to fit together. And, things like Glenn's work is just amazing to me. I mean, especially some of the stuff he's done with using light to help children who are suffering from mitochondrial diseases. We had a great X space with Bob, myself, and Glenn and Roger with this lady, a mother whose son was in hospice, and he'd been fighting some fungal infections as a result of a cancer problem. Had actually had to have one lung removed. He was put in hospice. Next thing you know, they asked him what he wanted to do. He said, "I just want to go outside." Sorry, outside one more time. And took him out, and all of a sudden he had these major changes. Now, it's an observational thing, but it's real. And I think that, the more you look at this stuff, the more you get the impression that there's something going on we should pay attention to. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No, no, that's absolutely fine. We've got a couple of questions coming through actually. Scott.
Sure.
So first one, or comments or questions. Martin Morreed. Hi, Martin. Thank you for joining us today, by the way. Point number one: since infrared is naturally predominantly a daytime stimulus, why should we add infrared to nocturnal artificial light sources? That's point number one. And number two: sunlight is critical for health, but it is a daytime stimulus. The blue spectrum needs to be removed substantially or substantially reduced at night. So do you have some comments on those two? Do you want me to start with number one again?
Well, let's see. Yeah, what was number one again? What was
Number one
that?
was since infrared naturally is predominantly a daytime stimulus, why should we add infrared to nocturnal artificial light sources?
Well, if you look at moonlight, it has a ton of near infrared in it, number one. Number two, I think the problem is that we're not talking apples to apples. You know, when we're outdoors that are going through nighttime, we're talking about levels that are orders of magnitude lower than what you are exposed to in these artificial light. We are generating an artificial environment that is essentially equivalent to daylight during the night, and then surprised when it causes some kind of an issue. So I think I just respond that, you know, you probably adding it at night, in all cases at all basically at all intensity levels, the near infrared to visible ratios in optical watts is basically the same. So, you know, whether you're talking about sunlight or you're talking about, you know, moonlight, you're really talking about having significant, always an amount of near infrared. But like I say, I think it's a bad connection. You know, we've created, like I say, where everybody wants to stay up late at night and watch their TV. And, you know, all I'd say is that if you're going to do that, at least add some near infrared into it to balance it out, because that's what that ratio is probably more important than anything else. But, you know, I can't argue with them. It is, you know, it is what it is. We're doing that. What was the second part?
Second one was sunlight is critical for health, but it's a daytime stimulus. The blue spectrum needs to be removed substantially reduced at night. And yeah, when Martin's referring to the blue spectrum, I'm understanding that as being blue as in artificial blue. Artificial lighting. Blue coming from artificial light.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd just say that again, you know, blue blockers and things of that nature that we're doing is because we're out of balance. You know, and if you don't have the right balance, then you can expect an adverse effect. I disagree that, um, you know, that there's any indication that there's, I guess I just say we're blocking blue because we're not providing red and near infrared in most cases. I mean, you look, like I say, run a spectrum on moonlight. There's a ton of near infrared out there on the outside portions of it, and you know it's again, it's always in proportion. Um, can I disagree with them on, you know, do I can I solve the problem? I mean, the problem is that we're not sitting around a campfire enjoying the benefits of that at a low level in a dark sky. We're sitting around what is now a bright sky with tons of excess blue, no end near infrared. You know, that's why I think that at the end of the day, we have created an environment that an artificial environment that we can't get away from, and that is not what the body is designed to operate under. And until we can get people to turn off lights on the outside of their buildings and things of that nature, you're always going to have this artificial light at night problem. And that's where I think so just blaming blue for it is not the solution, in my opinion. So.
So then we've got a couple more questions. Ali, thank you very much for joining today. We met yesterday, and I'm hoping you're enjoying the talk. So Ali's just asked, any studies about the effects and safety of blending different artificial light sources to mimic the complete spectrum of the sunlight? And I think you've, yeah, and then that's going to be one that I think you can answer quite easily. And then supplementing artificially the reds and near infrareds or UV separately, as opposed to the complete spectrum. Just thoughts on those two. So first of all, blending artificial light sources to mimic complete spectrum of the sun, and that's quite an interesting one for you, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Um, when you look at it, we have two opposites as far as spectrum. We have LEDs that are visible only, contain no near infrared. We have incandescents on the other end of the spectrum that contain 10 times, excess near infrared if you look at it in relationship to sunlight. So what sunlight is a combination of both. Blue's not bad, red's not bad, near infrared's not bad. It's all provided at one point in time, in one source. And there's a single sun, and we can all, you can kind of, it makes things fairly homogeneous. Yeah, what you see here and what you see there are all the same. Unfortunately, what we seem to be doing right now is trying to mimic that by putting in, oh, let's have an infrared over here, let's have a UV over here, we'll have a white one over here. And anybody who's done lighting knows, you end up with a orange and purple room, type thing. How are you going to ever know what you're getting as far as a spectrum in that particular location when this lamp's over here and that lamp's over here? So, our approach has been to basically take the best of both worlds. We use the LEDs to generate the visible portion of the solar spectrum. We take the incandescent small little filament bulbs to generate the incandescent part of the spectrum, or the infrared part of the spectrum, put the two of them together in a single bulb with a diffusing element on it. And that way I can tell you that, hey, you've got 3-to-1 near infrared to visible on that particular bulb. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than what. And the beautiful thing about it is that if you do it that way, because we've had such great advancements in LEDs, they're still only 50 or 60% efficient, but you put them all together and you can generate 3-to-1 near infrared to visible ratios and still do 50 or 60 lumens per watt. Can't do 120 lumens per watt, but I can do 50 or 60, which is 4 to 5 times better than an incandescent. Now, at some point in time, people have to compromise. And that's what I guess what I'd suggest is what you do. Now, other people have other approaches where they're trying to generate, using phosphors and near infrared LEDs. I would argue that they don't really do it, because when you truly look at the spectrum of sunlight and what it's doing when you get down into basic electron transfers that it's causing in the body, you need to have a peak somewhere in that 1 to 1.2 micron range. That is almost impossible to do efficiently with anything other than a filament source. And every time I turn around, I think, well, that wavelength shouldn't be mattering that much. All of a sudden, you find some benefit, or what appears to be a benefit, for the fact that we're supposed to be exposed to something that runs from 250 nanometers out to beyond 6 microns. And, that's what sunlight is. Taking and saying that you're going to do anything with only 400 nanometers or less of the visible spectrum, including doing circadian, is, in my opinion, wrong. You have to have the other component in order to balance out or do other things that are important to health. And, like I say, I don't know, but, some of the problems we're having with the space station and submariners and people at light at night, working night shifts, those things are way out of whack as far as their spectral content. Can we introduce enough near infrared back in? I think most people are pretty happy with sitting around a campfire at night, and fall asleep okay with that, under a blue sky. And, I think that's where I differ with a lot of the circadian people. I think once you get down to the point that you have the intensity low enough, spectrum is really irrelevant. So.
And so Ali's second question was supplementing artificially the reds and near infrareds or UVs separately as opposed to the complete spectrum. I think, if you don't mind, I'm going to start off the answer to this one potentially. The work that Glenn's been doing suggests that you can, have a very short amount of intervention on the infrared and have quite a long tail on it. 4 or 5 days worth of benefit from, let's say, a 3 to 5 minute intervention of infrared. Supplementing, yes, is probably a sort of a way forward, but maybe we should be thinking about yeah, if it's, I suppose coming back to nutrition, and I'll hand over to you in a second, Scott. But thinking about nutrition, if we ate healthily, we wouldn't need to supplement. So if we allowed ourselves to get a good amount of daylight, why would we need to supplement? But yeah, I'm going to hand the rest over to you, Scott.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, and I totally agree with Glenn, his data, there are been, you think about it just logically, the body's got to be designed to have a bad days and good days as far as sunlight. You're over there in UK, you're having a bad day, type thing. So the idea that it doesn't charge up and get it through, and Glenn over and over finds that, okay, it holds on till about 4 or 5 days. But it's kind of like doing trickle charging versus doing rapid charging for a Tesla for Musk. You know, they're two very different things. And I think that, the other thing that you have to be careful of is, again, we tend to do reductionist type experiments, and Glenn's experiments are great. It's one biomarker. What else is going on as well? And that's where it really, the body is doing thousands of simultaneous equations at once, as Bob would say, and, all those have to define whether or not we're healthy. And that's why you almost look at the red light therapy stuff and you say, well, that's one biomarker. Here's another one over here. This is another one over here. This is helping with dementia. This is helping with, when in reality, if they just put it all in and we spent a sufficient amount of time to get it on a regular basis, then there's a benefit. How important is cognitive learning for children? I mean, why would we put them in an environment that degrades their ability to learn? There's plenty of studies that seem to show that you learn better outdoors than you do indoors. I had a very interesting conversation with some people that were trying to help people in Chicago that battered women. And, his comment is that they were basically homebound because they were fearful to go out, and so in that particular environment, should we think about trying to help a little bit with the lighting, or should we put some conservatories up on top of buildings so that people could go up and get some sunshine, in a safe environment? There's a lot of things on an architectural side that we could be doing to bring back and do it in almost a free type thing, and people, I hope most people know they're listening to this, know that, it's not just the lighting, it's the displays, it's also the window glasses blocking all the near infrared and UV from coming into buildings for all great reasons. We're trying to save some energy. I'm not sure it's really working that well, but trying to. But how much the cost associated with degrading someone's health? And that's where I think you really start to get into this when you start looking in detail at all these different things that sunlight is doing in the body. You kind of are saying, it ain't worth it. I personally believe they should revoke the 120 lumen per watt because it makes it mathematically impossible for me to provide enough near infrared to even get close to simulating what we see outdoors. And again, I don't believe it has to do with the absolutes. It has to do with the ratios. And unfortunately, we don't see in the near infrared, or actually, fortunately, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a red snake and a blue snake, but that's a separate issue. But that's where I think that it really comes down to The government needs to get out of the way. We're in a period of, as I said, a renaissance for sunlight. There's going to be all kinds of discoveries. There's going to be all kinds of new understandings, and them getting in the way and mandating certain things that have negative consequences on our health is much more expensive as far as energy consumption than anything you can do by making an LED, more efficient. So
We've got a question from Khurshid. Thanks for joining, Khurshid. So have any studies been conducted on the effects of near infrared on blood glucose levels? And I think I can answer that one by saying that Glenn has definitely been doing some work. Now, Glenn worked on, his study was published in January or February this year, and he was using 670, which is still visible red. But I think, when I was speaking to Glenn yesterday, he mentioned that the reason for using 670 was because that was what other people had been playing with rather than anything more scientific than that. But he was able to get a response, reduce blood glucose levels using 670. But I believe he's equally capable of doing it with 850, which is in the infrared. But I don't know if you've got some comments on that, Scott.
no, I mean, I think that and bear in mind that Glenn's one of the few people that is doing things on people in real time under stress. And, so he's seeing results that other people haven't seen because they were measuring it during the actual stressor. And so, but, whether it's, if you look at it just as a rough comparison, in that particular we get exposed to 30 megajoules, up to 30 megajoules in sunlight. Glenn's doing it with 30 kilojoules of 670. He can do it with 850. It looks like that if you go down to 1,000, based on some of the study by Han Louis and all these others, that you can actually get down to a few kilojoules and see an observable change in something, some parameter, such as hemoglobin levels or things of that nature. So I think what we've underestimated is that when we're outdoors in sunlight, all the different processes in the body are being uplifted, upregulated, and providing us with an entirely different response than when we're stuck inside. And I look at it in my viewpoint, I look at it as all these different studies, 670, 850, 1064, 1270, they're all showing that there's something going on. There ought to be some photons there. And so when you're done, you end up at sunlight. That's just what you end up at. And if you put somebody in an environment that doesn't provide all those things, it was a pretty good bet, at least it used to be way back when, that the body was going to get exposed on a daily basis to a significant amount of UVB all the way out to six microns or a lot farther every day or every few days. And that was what it evolved under, and now what we're really starting to look at is also you have to look at some of the things that the body does and say, wow, there's no way we could even touch that with a 10-foot pole. You look at some of the stuff, the periodicities and the nanostructures that are being built in the body, and especially in plants and this, to control and redirect or make it more efficiency. Because at the end of the day, longevity is associated with both the energy efficiency and ability to protect yourself from pathogens. That's what longevity really is. We have trees that are thousands of years old, coral that are thousands of years old, that are extremely efficient at converting sunlight into the energy they need and also provide a protection barrier for the pathogens that we're in. So, I guess, I don't know if that answers the question, but.
I think it might do, but actually, I just want to pick up on that. And actually, next month we're talking to Professor Richard Weller, who's a dermatologist, and I think that Richard is a little bit like Glenn in the sense that of sort of stepping out of their own comfort zone and moving into a sort of a bigger spectrum of things. And Richard's work is looking at all cause mortality. Uh, as a relationship with exposure to the full solar spectrum, and actually, it seems that all-cause mortality drops, the more time we spend in sunlight, as opposed to conversely, that
Well, I mean,
there's been this messaging around stay out of the sun, right?
yeah, I mean, and I can understand because people's definition of the sun or staying out or going into the sun is we're going to lay on the beach and fry ourselves once a week or one for 1 week every year or a couple, every so often. And that's not what the body's intended or designed for. As when you think about it, we're really designed to be underneath a canopy of vegetation, or at least moving around into the shade, not being so much of what we're doing is associated with doing something from a solar etiquette standpoint is not the right thing to do. I mean, it's not that hard. Put on a hat. My grandpa was a dairy farmer. He wore a straw hat. He had long sleeve cotton shirt. He had overalls. And when it was lunchtime, he went and sat underneath the shade tree, and which is probably the best place to be under any circumstances because of the way it shifts the spectrum. But, kept his mind into his 90s and had no problems. You know, I just think that we want a certain thing, our comfort, we have something we want and we're doing it, but that then puts us at jeopardy of actually altering, causing a problem in another way. So I don't know. It's just there's just very
So,
clear indication. To me, it's just a very clear indication that having the full solar spectrum is important for our health. And, when you've got people in nursing homes that get 5 minutes a month of sunlight, I was kind of heartened. I saw some people, they had a long line of them all lined out in front of a nice sunny day, and they were sitting out there enjoying it. But, why can't we have a glass solarium without the near infrared blocking and UV blocking that people can go into when bad, on a nice day and get a little warming up and feel good about themselves. You know, again, I would recommend people look at some of Roger Seaholt's MedCram videos on the subject of near infrared. And, if you look at seasonality effects, I spent a lot of time, I wrote a paper on seasonality and the effect of reactive oxygen species on it. And, it's just when we start getting away from having a solar exposure, then the body is much more susceptible to a variety of different pathogens. And that's across, and not just pathogens. I mean, he recently, Roger showed how the all form death or whatever you call it um, was clearly linked strongly with everything from cancer to everything you could think of. Heart attacks were very seasonal, and I believe it's very much a function of not being able to get enough sunlight. You know, during COVID, there was this really interesting effect, or not interesting, a sad effect. Um, for you were 40 times a black African American was 40 times more likely to die of COVID than a sub-Saharan African. You know, and you think about that, that's millions of people. If we understood what was going on, we also showed that during the summer, we for the first time during COVID, before we had the vaccines, we actually had a biannual uh, seasonality to the disease for those people who were down in Arizona, Texas, Miami, Florida. They saw a bump in the number of COVID deaths during the summer. Well, it was air conditioning season. So what they do, they went inside under air conditioning. You look over in Italy where only 5% of the people had air conditioning, you didn't see the bump. They open a window. We close a window and filter out all the stuff that's in the air. And I think that's a real problem. So,
We've got another question a little while ago from Martin. Have you shown in human trials that balancing blue and infrared in the evening actually has effects on meaningful metrics such as glucose tolerance? And he's mentioned, yeah, we can reverse glucose intolerance by removing 440 to 495 nanometers blue at night. So, yeah, have we ventured into human trials? I suspect maybe not.
no, and I guess I don't understand really the question because, you know, turn off the light. I mean, that's the real problem here is we don't want to. So now what are we trying to do? We're trying to figure out how we can create an artificial light source that's efficient that allows us to stay up at night and radiate all our plants at night and create this artificial environment that was the body was never intended to be in, I guess. And I don't know, I'm not trying to be negative towards the whole thing. I'm just saying that we keep on trying to fix something uh, because we want some comfort or some other thing rather than just going and figuring out maybe how to sleep a little bit different or get outside more, hanging around. I don't know how to answer the question because it's an artificial condition that we've created that is negative. Now we're trying to figure out how far we can go. How much do we have to add back in order to make it so we can get by with doing what we shouldn't be doing in some ways? So, you
No.
know,
So, Scott, a little while ago, you sort of mentioned nanostructures, and I know you've been looking at this, and it seems to me that we've known about sort of nanostructures within plant life for a little while, and we're starting to realize that these nanostructures exist within the human body, and that those nanostructures have some role to play in delivering light. Is that correct?
yeah, and yeah, it's really just starting. We're kind of at the limits of what we can actually model. But if you take like the chloroplast inside it's like they have a stack of these watch batteries that are sitting there. But what it's actually doing is that it's on the scale of 70 nanometers. And what literally happens is that you're forming a Bragg mirror and you're actually using that to reject the green and localize the reds and the blue components that are very narrow band in chlorophylls in the areas where the those specific areas. And it's all part, plants are $200 million or 200 million years more advanced evolutionarily than we are. So they've got down to a science. They were here first. They took what they wanted and they very efficiently can convert sunlight into energy. And they've built these nanostructures that, like I say, reject the green because it's of no real use for the chlorophyll, but it also prevents the leaves from overheating because photosynthesis only works within a fairly narrow temperature range efficiently. So they've done all these things, and to me is just absolutely fascinating when you start looking and modeling some of these structures. You see that how sophisticated, how much, to what extent plants went to create the most efficient structure for collecting energy. They only extract the wavelengths they need, and they also have the ability to rotate and be efficient. But the bottom line is by doing that conversion very efficiently, and represents typically only 20% of the surface area of the cell, they have room for all this other stuff to happen, the mitochondria. So it's kind of like, I think our end goal down 100 million years from now will be to be half as efficient at using energy as plants are, and That to me is, and when we start looking in the body, you start to see that there are structures in the body, in the mitochondria. The spacings are on the order of what we're seeing in some of in the plants, and so I think that down the road, when I say a second road, I really believe between biosensors and all these new understandings we're getting, that we should be able to, really peg down what is sunlight doing in the body. So.
And so still staying on plants, and you mentioned the rejection of infrared. So is there a differentiating process then between plants and humans, or the sort of mammals, let's say, in respect to infrared? We clearly seem to need it for our mitochondrial function, but what about plants? Because plants obviously reflect quite a lot of infrared, but do they take some in for their mitochondria? How does that work?
Well, I believe they take some in for the mitochondria, but if you look at the reflectance characteristics of a plant, you see that, in the visible, you get less than 20% of the instant light reflected, mostly in the green because it has very good, real used to it. And plants were here first. They took what they wanted, and they strongly reject in the near infrared and longer wavelengths, um, which essentially, since we came after, I would argue is we got what was left over, and we're trying to use it as best we can. And you know those. So I would just say that I think that plants are have already extracted what they need, and when we're around it. But it's not just plants; it's also the ground you show on your background there. You know, it has a higher reflectivity in the near infrared than the visible. So, you know, there's all kinds of things going into the thing, but we were basically left with this part of the spectrum, and I happen to believe that we're using it as best we can. Um, and yeah.
I think, if I'm not wrong, and I think Bob might be on this call. So Bob, do feel free to correct me if I get this wrong. But essentially, what we're doing is almost the reverse of what plants are doing. In a certain sense, you've got plants who are sort of absorbing CO2. We're pushing it out. They're taking it in. They're giving us oxygen that way. Is light working in the same sort of way? They've taken what they need, and they're pushing back what they don't need, that then helps us. Is that a way of explaining it? I don't know.
Well, hmm, how do I say this without getting in trouble? Um, the I guess I would just say that um, if you look at a lot of the majority of the biological processes, they occur with an energy level that is equivalent to what we call in the near infrared, you know? So is that just a happenstance? Is that just a coincidence? I don't believe it really is. It's just that, when you look at electron transfers, you Google it or whatever you want, and most people who are doing work in redox reactions, essentially a photon comes in and changes the position of an electron, in those things. Those occur in biological systems in general in the near infrared energy levels that are equivalent to what we have in the near infrared. So will we find down the road? I hope as we get to the point we move. See, part of the thing is that if you look at the standard spectrum for sunlight, it's all visual, it's visually oriented. We talk about watts per meter squared per nanometer. So that shows this big peak in the visible, and that's all that is to sunlight, and all of these little bumps down into the infrared. But if you actually look at it from the standpoint of what is a photon, what's the most efficient way for an electron to be moved or transferred, like in the electron transfer chain, it's done at levels that are in the near infrared energy levels. So are those photons coming in and directly enhancing those energy electron transfers? You know, what was the quote by the thing? Life is nothing but an electron looking for a place to rest, was a Nobel Prize winning physiologist was saying. So eventually we have to get, so far we've gotten from talking about lumens to watts. Now the pot growers are talking about photons per second. And eventually we need to get to, okay, those photons per second are causing an electron transfer of some kind. And that's an entirely different spectrum. If you plot that spectrum, it has an entirely different look to it. It's the near infrared that is actually more important to that. It has a higher probability of changing biological processes. So it's kind of like we're walking down this little path to try and figure out what's going on. So, anyway.
So what do you think, architecture and design can do to sort of support a more healthy environment for people to, live and work in?
Well, number one, I think we need to deal with, there has to be somehow equated to a financial gain to get rid of some of the near infrared blocking characteristics and UV blocking. People have to overcome their fear of sunlight. Um, I think there's a lot of ways where architects can positively input, not just near infrared, but also, like I say, with how they do the design to have snow or sun tubes and things of that nature, to where you put in a certain amount of area where you can go and you can sit under a glass that doesn't meet all the requirements because it's there for help. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if we had every hospital, emergency room, the patient came in and the first thing they did was is they went into this nice little beautiful atrium area and with plants and all that stuff. Would that be a positive influence on it definitely helped their mentality, but it may actually help them physiologically. And that's one of the things I kind of I find almost kind of not funny, but interesting. You have all these people putting plant walls in buildings. Well, the primary function of the plant when we're outdoors is to reflect near infrared into our body. If you blocked all the near infrared from coming through the window and shining on the plant, what's the point of the plant? I'm not saying it doesn't do something from the humidification or other things like that nature, but you've basically taken away a key attribute of what we get from plants. And, we are Johnny come lately. We get what's left over in some ways from sunlight because everything else is taking it to some extent. And, that I guess is what I'd look at it as.
Yeah, so leads me on to another thing that we were talking about the other day, with Glenn and a few others about sort of the fact that certainly in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the US because I've not looked, but in the UK we have an aging population, and that's going to have a productivity impact at some point. And it struck me that Glenn has various graphs and stuff about when you have a bee and it's been sort of affected by insecticide and its mitochondrial function is reducing. You put the bee in a hive with red and infrared, and their mitochondrial function comes back to sort of strength, and possibly even almost full strength. So with aging populations, maybe we need to be thinking about this stuff to support productivity. I don't know. Well, I don't. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, it comes back. A simple thing is that, melatonin levels drop as we age. Cortisol levels actually go up as we age. Now so basically what's going on is we're essentially becoming in a lot of ways cortisol addicts as we age and also as our children are exposed to artificial light and not exposed to the other wavelengths. So I guess, there's a reason that people go down in the winter to Florida other than just to warm their bones. It happens to do that, but it happens to also change entirely their exposure conditions. And if you look at up in Norway and all that, they're doing ice plunges, they're doing saunas, they have a wood fireplace going on a regular basis, all trying to, in my opinion, enhance the ratios that they've got with some of these different hormones. And I really think that, sunlight is going through 7 orders of magnitude or more between daylight and sun and moonlight. And, in order to do that, any control system has to require on feedback loops that are based on ratios. I mean, it just, so have we identified melatonin and cortisol? Yeah. I bet you there's 100 different glucogen and insulin. All these things are being affected and altering the ratios. And as Glenn shows, I mean, it's not that you have to do everything 100%. You don't have to live outdoors. You need to it's kind of like uh, getting a boost every once in a while. And, or as we do, we try and trickle charge it and, try and not create the imbalance in the first place.
So what are the next steps? What are your next steps? What do you see as the future, Scott, in terms of the research and in terms of all the stuff you've been working on so far? What are your next steps?
Well, I think I'm lucky enough that I get to work a little bit with Glenn and Bob and Roger. And, we're kind of like the odd group because we're all very different. And I think that, especially Bob is some of the stuff he's doing with understanding it from a astrophysics standpoint, electron volts and all these other things. I'm really hopeful that we can actually show people why it's really important. But, for me personally, I'm doing a lot of stuff looking at the modeling of the nanostructures. There's a gentleman down in Texas that has been showing that, has some great insight in that area. And I think once you start seeing that the body is doing some pretty amazing optics to get to align light rays to the cones and the rods and things of that nature, you start to appreciate that it's a little bit more complex than that. I am excited about doing this stuff with biosensors for Ceram, looking at how sweat changes all these different parameters. Hopefully we'll be able to see something good there. I guess the other thing is I'm trying to figure out a way to raise awareness to where we can get the government off our back from the standpoint of, I understand they were trying to do a good thing. It is not a good thing. It is a bad thing. In fact, I would say if they want to put anything in place, put a requirement in that you could not have a light source that has greater than 60 lumens per watt. It's the other way that they need to be blocking, not the way they're doing it now. I understand that everybody thinks it's great, but if it's affecting your child's health, I'm sorry. They need to, it was a regulation that was poorly thought out. I was at one of the public hearings way back when, and I was told we'll never go above 45 lumens per watt. And they lied, and I'm sorry, but we need to stop that. I think we do need to get. I'm hopeful in some ways that RFK Jr. would maybe at some point notice that lighting is just as important as food. I know it's an easy hit to go after the food people now, but you think about the impact. There's so many different modern maladies that we can mechanistically link to lack of sunlight. And, it's not just one. And if we could do anything to get the government to get out of the way and let the discovery go forward, I think that'd be a good thing. And then the other thing I'm trying to do is make enough light bulbs where I make some money at the end of the day. And if you could convince the EU that I could sell my bulbs over there without getting fined, I would be very thrilled with you. So.
I think, yeah, so there's a couple of things that came out from that. I think one of the challenges, and I do feel that the nutritional side of the sort of health spectrum gets a lot of airtime. And I get the impression that that's because it's quite tangible. Um, whereas light it's really intangible. Yeah, it appears in a space, but you can't touch, you can't feel it, you can't feel the quality of light. Your physiology responds to the quality of light, but you can't grab it, you can't hold it. And move out of that zone, and then you've got the ultraviolet, you've got the infrared, which are totally invisible to us. How do you drive that through to people's understanding that it's actually a nutritional it has a nutritional impact in that sense. But actually, I don't know what it's like in the States, but here, in the UK, we have nutritional facts labels on all food types. When you buy a biscuit or you buy a loaf of bread, you should have a nutritional fact label. But why doesn't light have a nutritional fact label? Because at least that way, rather than seeing how energy efficient it is, you'd be looking at the packaging going, that's not very good, that one. I'm going to go for something which is a bit healthier. Maybe we need to shift the consciousness to having nutritional facts stated on a light source, and maybe those nutritional facts can be compared to sunlight. At least then people would start to understand that light is important.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And it's just that there's so many things. I mean, it's like Huberman, I think, is now pushing some blue blockers or something like that. Why is it that we have to go, we put a light in and we have to filter part of it because it's toxic, it makes me feel bad. Rather, and so if I'm looking at Starry Nights by Van Gogh, I can't see the blue in the thing because my glasses are blocking all the blue reflected. So it's like every time we turn around, I think one time one of the VC types that we said no to, he said, you can take away anything, but you can't put stuff back. That's the real rub. And because they've been convinced that, hey, look at all this energy I'm going to save because by taking away 90% of the spectrum. Now you go back and you say, excuse me, sir, that part of the spectrum was actually important and you need to put it back and you're going to have to pay a little bit more for your electric bill. Well, I would hope that what they take and say is, okay, I'll put it back in, but I will now turn my bulbs off on a regular basis, especially at night, rather than lighting up my trees and my facades and all these other things. I know the industry, we as an industry make a lot of money on those facades, but they're really negative to a lot of people. And as you say, it's hard with light because way back when rickets, people could see that the pollution was blocking the light, and the kids weren't getting UVs. But now we've got this really great modern cave that it looks like it's nice and bright, but if you looked at any place other than right where our eyes see, you'd see as boy, that's a dark, dank place. I don't want to be there. And that's where I think the real rub comes in. And also it's just hard to get people to perceive. It's a fairly technical area it's not easy to measure. It's not easy to, I can't just, other than some of Bob's work where he's done with photography, looking in the near infrared, people don't, they don't see. It's not like they take a picture of it and understand it as well as they should. So
Uh,
anyway,
Actually, have you ever come across Neil Harbisson?
no.
Okay, so Neil Harbisson was born with achromatopsia, which means that he can only see grayscale, and eventually he got an implant in the back of his head, which is basically a photocell, and so that photocell translates color into noise, sound. So he hears color. Interestingly, the brain and he's got a fantastic TED talk. But the brain, can hear infrared and ultraviolet because the photos. So it's our visual system which is not able to deliver that information to the brain. The brain can sort of process the environment as far as ultraviolet and infrared, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But yeah, it's a brilliant, brilliant TED talk. I think without a doubt, I think Martin will probably agree with this one, is that if we push the boundaries to 120 lumens per watt delivered from a retrofit lamp, I don't think there's going to be anything good in that light source whatsoever. We are pushing into the blues in a strong way without any counterbalance.
Yeah.
Wojtek has asked a question, or put something into the chat. Light nutrition bears an important question. Should then the lighting fixtures be considered medical-ish devices? They activate and/or relax many processes in our bodies, after all.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, my opinion, it's just my opinion, is that we need to find a way to move this more into the medical realm. Being around Roger and how he thinks and how he's trying to, looking at the problem, the medical community is much more, now they have to move up a little bit, and, they used to be poo-pooers. Now they're starting to slowly accept it. But I think that there's no doubt that what we're providing to people as far as the lighting coming out of that fixture has a biological effect. And right now, I would argue that it's a toxic effect. Other people would argue that you're providing a benefit by putting it back in. I'm arguing that you shouldn't be exposed to it in the first place, especially children with dark skin. Those are the things that I would say that, you think about how many, kids don't go out for recess. They don't go and build a tree fort. They don't do a lot of stuff that we used to do. So it is a turning point, or, in what we would consider exposure levels for this generation. And so far, there's so many different areas that you can almost say, yeah, duh, that it's important for us to find out, get the research done. And it's not, again, I would also argue that sunlight should not be viewed just from the standpoint of flight. Sunlight causes an effect on your ability to, our other things like generating, as I said, reactive oxygen species in the air we breathe, affecting insect populations, affecting plants. I mean, how many people are very worried about climate change, but I think they ought to be more worried about the immediate impact that some of our solutions are having on things like bugs. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, you'd have to. I actually worked at a gas station, had to clean the bugs off the window in Kansas in the summer. There's a lot of bugs. I don't see those bugs anymore. We see these plants that are growing thicker skin so that the insects can't eat them. We see, you want to talk about something that is truly might be a catastrophe. We lose our insect population. We lose plants, start having other issues. What are we doing now? We're taking bees and putting them in trucks and driving them over to California just to get them pollinated properly. I think that there's immediate consequences to what we thought was something good for the environment, where we're actually doing harm to the environment. So.
And you mentioned something there about sort of the younger generations, and we talked about it just before the session went live. And I think if I remember rightly, the paper or the study was called Survey of Modern Life, and it was a study of how Americans spend their time. And one of the things that struck me there was that the 18 to 24-year-olds, as we said earlier, spend somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes outdoors a day, which is a shockingly low amount of time. and at the same time, sort of around January, February this year, the Resolution Foundation released a paper here over here in the UK that suggested that that same age group, the 18 to 24-year-old age group, between 2021 and 2022, were prescribed 500,000 of them were prescribed antidepressants. Now, I'm not the science. I don't, but in my head, and it's just my thoughts. Is there a correlation there between lack of time spent outdoors and the impact on mental health and well-being? I don't have the answer, but I would hazard a guess that maybe there is a connection somewhere.
Well, and everything we're doing, the one thing that I spent a lot of time on melatonin, but immediately when I started to understand the relationship to cortisol, then all of a sudden you start looking at it, and we literally everything we do, Dr. Ray or Professor Ray at I think it was up there at RPI showed in a study that exposure to blue light in increased cortisol levels within 30 minutes or an hour or something like that by 30%. Everything that we're choosing to do tends to come in on the side of cortisol and downward towards melatonin. Now, is cortisol important? Cortisol is very important. It's your response to stress. Have a stressor, cortisol, adrenaline, then cortisol kicks in, but it can take literally hours for cortisol to return back to levels, except when in the case where melatonin is present, where it tends to suppress the ACTH, at least according to the papers I've read, and therefore reduce cortisol levels back to them. Because elevated levels of cortisol are bad for extended period of times are bad. We know this. It affects anxiety, affects all these different things. So if we've created this artificial environment that it tends to elevate our overall cortisol on a regular basis, and then I think it's pretty straightforward to make the argument that we've created these cortisol addicts. And and unfortunately, what follows cortisol tends to be a dopamine high to reinforce it. And so, it can be almost addictive in a lot of ways. And I don't know why there isn't more research into understanding the impact of that on children in particular. I mean, you think about all the stuff we're talking about now with the glasses that we're going to do and the virtual reality things that they spend all their time in, the myopia epidemic that's flooding across the country, already 80% in North Korea or South Korea. There's just too many things that are kind of going wrong that, I consider that a lot of it's like, people get worried about EMF. Well, one of the best ways to take EMF is to convert it into a bunch of pulsing lights and then shine it on somebody's face. It's still the EMF, but it's being transmitted to the body in the form of light. And you think about all the different ways. That's why one of the things I really hope at some point we can do is get people to dim using analog approaches. It's much more simple. It's much more effective. You think about the amount of money that goes into some of these control systems nowadays in our industry, where they're trying to control light levels and have to have feedback because this one age is different than that one. And, all these things that people are doing. If we could just get to the point we had a source that was naturally changed, and that's what ours does, is it goes from mostly LED down to incandescent, and that's what you want. If the light bulb does it, then you don't have to do all this crazy control stuff. So that's probably why I'll kill it right there, because the industry wants to put controls.
So I think we're sort of running to time. I don't know if we want to see if anybody has any further questions. There's been obviously quite a few questions. Sort of open it up to the floor if anybody has any questions, because it's been certainly has been absolutely fascinating so far. And let's just see if there are any further questions. Nothing coming through as yet.
I was going just looking down through my notes. I think that one thing also that I'd like to say is there's so many things that are happening on a technological basis. I mean, literally, you've got equipment capability where you can actually measure living cells and while you're exposing them to different kinds of light that we could be doing. There's just so many opportunities to understand because as I said, it's not just one thing that's coming forward. You've got all these different biosensors and all these things that are coming across that provide us with data, and then we take lens work and just start expanding that into other biomarkers, then I think you're going to start getting people's attention eventually. So.
I come back to the point that it's a little bit strange in a in the sense that we've known about photosynthesis for about 250 years, and we're sort of a little bit surprised of what's being found out now. It seems that it was probably quite obvious, but we just for some reason we just didn't think about it.
Yeah, but again, everything takes its time. Science takes time from the standpoint of, up until just recently, we have to give you an idea of how stupid we are relative to nature. I mean, we were unable to even measure the different levels within the chloroplast at 70 nanometers and the spacing of it. And we still are, and yet the body has evolved to the point it makes those. It not only makes the structure using, lipids and other things and puts everything in its right place, but it then does a biochemical process that we could no more do than the man in the moon. But plants do it by the jajillions, every day. And I think we need a little better appreciation for how sunlight's being used and what we give it credit for. So anyway.
And so Tom's posted a question. Thank you, Tom. Is there any hope of influencing the EU or US regulations when the trajectory is so focused on energy efficiency? What needs to happen to change that?
Don't want to go political, but RFK Jr. maybe would do it if you get the inkling. I mean, I think the problem been that it was 45 lumen per watt, and they were mainly trying to get rid of mercury from compact fluorescence by upping it to 120 lumens per watt, and that's just the wrong way to look at it. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know how you get the right people's attention, but there's enough science out there to at least ask the question. And like I say, if Musk wants to get a bunch of astronauts to Mars, he better figure this out because right now everyone that comes down after 6 months has got mitochondrial dysfunction. And is it just to do with light? I don't know. Probably has to do with microgravity, has to do with a lot of stuff, and I really think that I hate to play the card, but in some ways, what we're doing discriminates against certain parts of the population. If you're someone with very dark skin, you need 3 times the amount of solar exposure to generate the same level of stimulus as somebody like you or I. If you have children, children are much more in tune to the amount of uh, of effect. I mean, and maybe it just needs to up the ante because there's clear indications that sunlight can have a positive influence on cancer cells. I mean, there was a really great study out by the Guy Foundation where they looked at cancer cells, and I had made the point that there were certain wavelengths where cancer cells absorb more energy than healthy cells. And it's really the kind of the basis behind hypothermia treatments that are used to fight cancer. What we did is we did a series of models and showed that while you can't localize temperature in the cells because of the blood flow and all the other fluids, interstitial fluids, what you can do is you can localize reactive oxygen species. So what the Guy Foundation and Bell's group showed is that 734 nanometers caused cancer cells to age at a higher rate than healthy cells. Now, I would argue it had just happened that they used what I had shown was one of the water overtones, where there is an increased level of Ross generation in water at those particular frequency wavelengths. So, ultimately my goal would be that we would take this thing and figure out how to help the body supplement. Nobody's going to cure cancer with it, but what they are going to do is maybe cut down on the amount of chemo that's required to be effective. Again, it's kind of like walking the patient into the room. You want that patient, and this is one of the things that Roger does so well and talks about so well. His goal is to make that patient have the highest probability of success. And, right now I would argue the environment we put them in is the exact opposite. And, everything from, how they're stimulated as far as anxieties, clear up to cancer. And, read the paper from Bell's group. I think it's just absolutely fascinating. And if we can create environments that fight or give the body its highest probability of success, it's kind of like what I believe with the environmental factors with COVID or the next pandemic. We can put together systems, and we could be a real hero here if we're willing to look a little bit beyond, just lumens per watt. So
Amazing. So we don't have any more questions at the moment. So Scott, it has been, really nothing short but fascinating. And I just want to thank you very much for your time today and that in sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your research. As I go back to, what really inspired me to start learning a little bit more about light as opposed to lighting, which was your paper. So I want to thank you for that. And whilst we've still got a few, number of people on the line, the series continues in the new year. In January, we'll be talking to Professor Richard Weller, a leading dermatologist, and he's been, as I said before, looking at the relationship between exposure to the full solar spectrum and all-cause mortality. And I believe his research suggests that actually all-cause mortality drops as a consequence of exposure to the full solar spectrum. In February, we're going to be talking to Ty Farrow of Farrow Architects, and Ty has just released a book titled Constructing Health. And Farrow Architects as a practice specializes in salutogenic design. And then in March, we'll be talking to Simon Carter, author of Rise and Shine, Sunlight, Technology and Health. And it's a sociological study on our connection to the sun. So really looking forward to those talks in the first quarter of next year. Scott, once again, I thank you for the fascinating insights that you've shared today, and I'll be looking into whether or not we can get the EU to accept the fact that we're running at 60 lumens per watt. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. I would just put the disclaimer that I'm not a doctor. This is all just, and I would appreciate anybody who has a disagreement with it. Let me know. I believe in open debate, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk at this thing. And again, I'd like to thank all the people along the way that I've been working with that have put their input in, positive and negative, over the last several years. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll chat soon.
All right.